it's Mo. If you watched part 1 of my May reading wrap-up, you know that this one ended up being the month where I read the most books. Every month I do a reading wrap-up that is vlog style, so I talk about the books for about 5 minutes. I talk about what I liked about them, what I didn't like about them, what I got out of them, and they end up always being super long because I try to talk about them as soon after I've read them as I can. I usually read about 10 to 12 books a month. 5 minutes talking about each book end up being quite long. But this month I ended up reading double what I normally read, so the wrap-up was going to be excruciatingly long, and I decided that it would make more sense if I broke this wrap-up into 2 parts. So you are seeing the second part right now. If you want to go and see the first 10 or so books that I read in the month, head over to the other video, the part 1 of this May reading wrap-up, and watch that before you watch this. This video will contain like the wrap-up of my wrap-up. So we are jumping in where we left off in the last video. Let's go. It is May 12th, and I finished 2 more books in May. I finished If You Are Lonely and You Know It by YiYun Lee. This is a very short, only 50-minute audiobook that I read from one of my subscriptions, and I was really interested to read a book by YiYun Lee because I'm interested in their book, The Book of Goose. People seem to really not like that, even though it has a super beautiful cover, but it sounded interesting to me. So I think the reason that people don't like that one is because they compare it to My Beautiful Friend, and I have no intention of reading My Beautiful Friend, so I think maybe I would like The Book of Goose. My best friend read My Brilliant Friend, and he really loved it. He read that whole series, and he thinks I should read it, but I don't think so. So if you think I should read it, leave me a comment down below. If You Are Lonely and You Know It follows a man who was born and raised in Oakland, California, and when he was young, his mother abandoned him and left him with a family friend to be raised by that friend. Years later, after his divorces and after he's had a career and everything, he finds himself needing a home, and he goes back to be a boarder with that same family friend who raised him. So it's a very comfortable position in some ways for him, but he is dealing with the gentrification of the neighborhood, and it is now during the pandemic, and when his stepdaughter, his ex-stepdaughter, asks him to take care of her pit bull, he gladly accepts to help her out. He loves her and still wants to be connected to her, but he finds that having this pit bull in this kind of gentrified, becoming more bougie neighborhood during the pandemic causes him some trouble. So that's the story, basically, and of course it's a very, very short story, so I won't tell you more than that. It's told in a very interesting way where you're hearing the main character's thoughts and kind of hearing his thought process about things, like calling his stepdaughter his ex-stepdaughter because he's not married to her mother anymore. He doesn't feel like he can fully claim her as his own. And that kind of distance that he finds himself from everything in the world is a big part of this book. So he always finds himself at a distance from his wives when he was married, from his biological family, and from his found family. He finds himself at a distance from the new people moving into the neighborhood and the gentrification of the neighborhood, and it's kind of just a story about how he processes the world. So I liked it. I thought it was interesting. I liked the way it was written, but it was a book that felt to me like there was going to be like a point at the end. There was going to be like a sting, and I don't know if there was or not. Like, I don't know if I missed it or it actually wasn't there. So I think this is one that I'm going to go back and reread. I'm not going to count it as a reread or anything, but because it's only 50 minutes, I think I can just go back, reread it, maybe when I'm in the car or something and I have nothing else to divide my focus on listening to it, and see if I get something more out of it. But on the whole, I enjoyed it. The next book that I finished in May is Witches of Lychford by Cornell. This is the start of a novella series, and it follows 3 women in Lychford. You're not sure where Lychford is. I think it's England. It seems like England to me, and Cornell is English, so that would make sense. One of them is a reverend who lived in the town but has returned after a tragedy. One of them is her estranged best friend who had a psychotic break a few years ago, which is one of the reasons why they lost touch in their friendship. And one of them is a cantankerous old woman who is purported to be a witch in the area. So these three women come together to fight a potential evil threat to the town of Lychford. That's all I'm going to say about it because it is very short. It's only 144 pages. I don't know. So I liked this book. It didn't have a lot of stuff going on. It didn't have a lot of plot. It didn't have a lot of character development. It didn't have a lot of spooky stuff or witchy stuff or political stuff or village life stuff. It had a little bit of all those things. And is that because it's 144 pages and it's very short? Is that because it's the first in a series, so they're setting us up for finding out what goes on? I did like our three main characters. They were all very distinct and they all had reasons for being who they were and relating to people the way that they did, which I think was the most interesting part of this book. I did also like the witchiness in this, that there was room for God in the witchiness, there was room for science in the witchiness, there was room for nature in the witchiness, and the threat that's facing the town has the possibility of being very vast. So there's a lot of ways that more of these books could go. Before I picked this up at a community book sale, I had never heard of it before, but I'm definitely interested in finding and reading the sequels when I do find them. Like I said, I don't think it was anything super amazing. I don't think it did anything new, and I think it actually had some like tropes or aspects that I really don't like. One of the things I really dislike is when a character gets injured, especially in the face, and then they talk funny. I don't know why, but that just bothers me so much. Like, so in this, something happens to one of the characters' noses, and then she talks, you know, like a fake nose talk, and it's written in there in that way that she's like missing letters, and if you hurt your nose, you can talk normally. That's like a weird TV, movie, book myth. So, I mean, maybe if you like cut your nose off or something, you couldn't, but like if you hit your nose and your nose is bleeding or you're holding your nose, you can still talk fine. I don't understand that. Little things like that I really didn't like, but I think that was the biggest one of the things that I really didn't like. And those were two more books that I read in May. It is May 18th, and I have finished 5 more books in May. I finished my first reread of the year, which was Invisible Monsters by Chuck Palahniuk. This is a story of a young woman, a supermodel, who is in a horrific accident where she loses part of her face, and so she is extremely disfigured and can't speak anymore. She can't pursue her modeling career. Some people in her life abandon her when this happens. Some people seemingly embrace her, but she finds a kind of solace when she meets a drag queen named Brandy Alexander, and they go off on adventures together. This book is famous for its body horror and I think for its extreme nature of storytelling, because it is told in all different timelines within each chapter. So you're hopping around. Now you're doing this, now you're doing that, and you're finding little bits of things out. There is a remix of this book where they tell it in a linear way, but I really feel like that would probably be an injustice to this book, because I think the reveals and the twists and the turns that you get throughout this book come about because you are a little bit confused about what's going on and because you don't know certain things until like the very end of the book. It's also shocking, and it makes you go back and reconsider so much of what you've already read, which is part of the reasons that I love it. I reread this one because I used it for a prompt in a tag video, and when I went back and read the synopsis on Wikipedia to make sure it would fit, it was so different than I remembered that I was like, oh, well, I have to reread this now. All Palahniuk's books read so extremely quickly. He has this amazing way of using difficult structure and difficult language and gruesome aspects and repetitiveness and technical ideas that all make it seem like his books would be extremely difficult to read, but instead they flow very much like a brain works. So I like to say that Palahniuk writes like your brain thinks in many ways, and that definitely was the case here. I also think that Palahniuk's work can be controversial because he is obviously writing horror. He's writing lots of body horror, lots of disturbing ideas, manipulation, depressing subject matters, gruesome subject matters, all of that. And he's trying to push your buttons. He's trying for that ick factor. He's trying for your astonishment and disgust a lot of times. So it's hard to say that he's problematic because I think a lot of his problematic elements are intentional. I thought this book had a lot of interesting conversations to be had around transgender identities and drag identities and queer identities. And I think that actually he was, for the most part, being fairly respectful in this book. I think he was using respectful language a lot of times, but some of the ideas of this book could be seen, I think, as anti-trans as well, although I don't think that's the intention. I enjoyed my reread of this. I definitely remembered more than I did when reading the synopsis as I was reading it, and I still thought the twists were twisty and super interesting. Even though the twists were kind of what I remembered most about this book, it's still, just reading it is pretty shocking. The next book that I read in May was The Weddings by Alexander Chee. This is a short story from one of my subscriptions, and this is about a gay man who at the time is going to his first weddings of his gay friends because gay marriage has just become legalized in the United States. So he and his boyfriend are learning about each other. They're fairly new together, and now they're going to each other's friends' weddings, and they're thinking about weddings themselves. They're thinking about marriage and whether they want to get married either to each other or at all at some point in the future. When our main character is invited to an old friend's wedding who he hasn't talked to much in the last 10 or 20 years, he is initially surprised but accepts immediately, and that kind of brings up all the nuances of he and his friend's relationship and what he has and hasn't told his boyfriend. So this was a very short story, and I did like this one. I thought it was interesting in that it was very normal. It was very day-to-day life. When you are a young person and all your friends start getting married and having kids, that is like signals a change in your life. So it was interesting to see from a gay perspective of someone who didn't have that for so long, and then like older gay couples are getting married. And personally, it affected me specifically because obviously I remember when that first happened, and I remember when my gay friends started getting married and how different and exciting that was to straight weddings. Not that I don't like straight weddings, because I love weddings. Anybody ever want to invite me to their wedding, I'm a great wedding guest. I did enjoy this one, and I definitely would read more from Alexander Chee. I thought he had an interesting voice, and there was a little bit of drama and a little bit of intrigue in this one, so I would be interested to see what he would do with a longer novel. The next book that I read in May was A Bestiary by Lily Huang. I found this one in a little free library, and it is a mostly memoir, a little bit autofiction of Lily's life, and it's told in very short vignettes. So I really, really enjoyed this one. It has like multiple chapters, and it talks about Lily's life. It talks about common themes that she sees interspersed with retellings of fairy tales and allegories and how that connects to her life, or how she sees her life through that. She is a professor teaching fiction and literary fiction and fairy tales and things like that in colleges. And then it also has like facts and ideas kind of interspersed in there. I did tab a few things. I thought there was some really interesting ideas in this, some poignant and pretty moments. And it talks a lot about Lily's experience as a second generation Vietnamese American, or a first generation Vietnamese American, a second generation Vietnamese immigrant. So her parents were Vietnamese and spoke Vietnamese, and it just kind of all the many things, many ideas, many difficulties, many joys that go into being a daughter of immigrant parents. It talks a lot about her relationships and her toxic relationships, how she was in an abusive marriage. Definitely a lot of trigger warnings for abuse of a spouse. Some sex in there kind of in the end, which was thrown in and I didn't really love. I don't think necessarily added very much to it. Overall, I really enjoyed this one. It was super quick, super easy to get through, told in a non-linear fashion, but definitely made sense and was super easy to read. I look forward to reading more of Lily Huang's work if I can find it. And I have the feeling that she's probably a poet. This read very much almost like prose poetry. If she does have collections of poetry, I would definitely be interested in reading them. The next book that I read in May was The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein by Kirsten White. This is a retelling, reimagining of the Frankenstein story as told from Elizabeth, Victor Frankenstein's adopted sister / love interest. So I read Frankenstein for the first time last year and I really enjoyed it. It was not at all what I expected and it was much more thrilling and exciting, but also nuanced than I thought it would be. And I think this is a very faithful retelling, reimagining from Elizabeth's perspective. So instead of following Victor as he comes to understand about life and death through the death of his infant brother and his mom and his worry over Elizabeth getting sick, we see all those things from Elizabeth's perspective. Instead of seeing Victor go off to school and try to conquer life or conquer death to make it possible for the people that he loves to live forever, we see that from Elizabeth's perspective. And we meet up with Elizabeth as she's going to him once he's kind of disappeared, once he's already created his monster, and the tale ensues from there. It follows every beat pretty much that Frankenstein follows, you know, obviously, but from Elizabeth's perspective. It was interesting. I like the idea of creating a character for Elizabeth because we don't see her a lot in Frankenstein, and we know that she is the driving factor or one of the driving factors for Frankenstein to create his monster, but we don't really learn that much about her. Definitely the depiction of women in Frankenstein, even though it was written by a woman, is overshadowed by the depiction of men. This is a young adult novel, and I think that that definitely shows in a lot of respects. I think that it is a little bit long, it is a little bit repetitive, it is a little bit obvious and or clear to see like what direction this story is going in, but I did enjoy it. I read this on audio, and this is the first audiobook I've ever read sped up, but I had to. The audio narrator was really good, I think, but they spoke so slowly, it made me feel like I was going insane, partly. Like I could not concentrate on what they were saying. It was so slow to the point of distraction where you couldn't comprehend what was happening. So speeding it up really worked for me, and I was happy to get through it that way. The audiobook that I read was one from my free audio sites, and actually it didn't have the last like 45 pages. It cut off before then, so I was super happy to have a physical copy of this book and be able to read that last little bit on my own. But then I also did have like the audio narrator's sped up voice in my head while I was reading it, which was interesting. I want to read more Frankenstein retellings or reimaginings or continuations for sure, but I think this is probably a really good place to start because it is so faithful. It doesn't do anything like wildly amazing, but I do think it was quite interesting. The 17th book that I read in May was Other Words for Home by Jasmine Warga. This is a middle grade book told in verse, and it was super fast and easy to get through, but also super beautiful and poignant. I tabbed only one tab on this one, but I think this is a great book for all ages, but especially young people. And it follows our main character, Jude, who moves with her mother from Syria when the Syrian war is happening, when there is a lot of danger and fighting going on, especially in Aleppo. Jude and her mother and her mother's next unborn child go to America, to Ohio, to live with Jude's uncle and leave behind Jude's father and her older brother. The story first takes place in Syria, which I think was interesting. I've never read a book set in Syria before, and then the rest takes place in Ohio, and it has mostly to do with Jude growing up, coming to understand her responsibility towards others, coming to understand the idea of taking care of others, whereas she has been taken care of previous to this, but also Jude fitting in American society. When Jude first moves to America, she's not wearing her hijab, and then in the course of her living there, she begins to wear it, and what that signals for her, what that signifies. This is a hard book to read. I definitely cried multiple times reading this book, but I really loved it. It was done in a very gentle way, even though it deals with extremely difficult topics. At its heart, this book is what it says on the tin, and it is feeling at home in different places, coming to understand yourself, coming to understand your identity and your place in the world, and how other people affect that, and how they create and sometimes destroy that fact too. You can let the hate of others destroy you, or you can let the love of others hold you up, and it's all about finding your place in the world, finding your home. I would definitely highly recommend this to everyone. Super short, super easy to get through, lovely, especially recommended for young people because I think it does tell a very identifiable story of growing up. So whether you're a middle grader, whether you're a young adult, whether you're an adult, you can identify with Jude and some aspects of her story. But because she is a brown person coming to America at a time of strife, she goes through so much adversity that you can also learn from her experience. Those were more books that I've read in May, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is May 21st, and I have read 3 more books in May. I read Jazz Funeral by Julie Smith. This is the 3rd book in the Skip Langdon series, and I've read up to book 4, so this is the 4th book I've read, but the 3rd in the series. Jazz Funeral follows Skip Langdon, who is a detective in the New Orleans PD, and she is actually just attending a event with some people who are going to be at Jazz Fest, which is a huge event that happens every year in New Orleans, when the person that she is going to see, the person who is putting on this event, which is a charity event to raise money for their charitable music foundation, is found murdered in his home. Skip quickly takes charge of the scene and makes sure that she contains the scene, and she finds out that not only is this man found murdered, but his little sister, who was in the house, maybe at the time of the murder, has gone missing. Skip is not only looking for a murderer, but she's looking for the little sister to see if she perhaps is the murderer, or if she saw something that she shouldn't have, and why she's now on the run. This book follows Skip, and her long-distance boyfriend happens to be in town at the time. She talks about her neighbor slash best friend and what's going on with him, and she investigates this case. But this book is almost, I would say, like 60-40 split with the perspectives of the young girl who's run away and her family and her parents and how they're looking for her. So it's really less about Skip than any other book in the series, and it's less detective work. There's no way that you could guess the murderer in this book because there's no clues, nobody's finding anything out, and you're really just in the head of this young girl for the majority of the book, which could be interesting. And I think one of the things that's interesting about these books is that Julie Smith always adds something to them that are not just cozy mystery. So there are always wider topics at play within every one of the Skip Langdon books that I've read. And there are multiple topics in this one. You know, Skip's best friend's sister is dying, and he's thinking of taking care of her children. We're dealing with this young girl. We're dealing with what she knows or doesn't know about the murder, but we're more dealing with her as a runaway and the different possibilities there are for her, the dangers, and how this teenage girl's mind works. That aspect really just didn't work for me. I really hated being in the mind of Melody, the runaway teenager, for so long. I think if it had been shorter and there had been more actual detective work and more of Skip, that's why I'm reading the books, is the scenes of New Orleans, which were strong in this, and for Skip's perspective and her detective skills, I wouldn't have minded so much. But because we were so heavily with the runaway, it really was such a drag to get through. It took me almost a month to read this book, which is super long for a fast mass market cozy mystery. I really, really didn't enjoy this one. But I would suggest the other Skip Langdon books. Now, these are all set in the 90s, and they were written in the 90s, so there's definitely some problematic elements and some outdated language and ideas. The next book that I read in May is A House at the Bottom of the Lake by Josh Malerman. This is a short horror novella about two teenagers who are meeting in the beginning of the summer. They're super excited about summertime. They're both 17. And when the boy asks the girl out, she knows that she can't pass this opportunity up. Not only for the potential love connection, but just for the summer adventure. She's super delighted that this young man wants to take her canoeing for their first date, and they have a great time exploring two lakes in the area. When they see a storm tunnel that leads to a third lake, they immediately agree that they have to investigate, and that lake leads them on a venture that they never thought possible. They squeeze their way through this storm drain onto the third lake and find a perfectly formed house under the lake. They go to greater and greater lengths to stay by the house to learn more about the house. And it's a really interesting horror book. There's definitely a lot of unease, not like creeping dread, which is something that I hate, but just the unease of the unusual and the bizarre. So you're definitely feeling their excitement at these discoveries and every new discovery that they make about the house, but you're also just feeling like a real unease and unsettlement at why this house is here, what's happening, are they really seeing what they're seeing, and what exactly is going on in this scenario and this environment that they've found themselves in. I really enjoyed that part. It's very atmospheric. It does a great job of capturing that idea of being on the verge of adulthood and knowing that maybe you're not doing the exact right thing, but doing it anyway, of that idea of wanting that summer adventure, that summer love, that love connection. So all those things I think were really great. But I do think that the book was trying to send a message and creating itself as a allegory for something, whether that's just young love, whether that's the discovery of sex, whether that's coming of age. It felt like it was like a thinly veiled message, but almost so obvious that it was hard to discern what the obvious thing was. So I did feel that it was a little heavy-handed and overdone. The symbolism and the steps that were taken towards this potential danger and growth and idea were too based on or around another theme. And again, maybe that theme was sexuality and learning your sexuality and coming to understand sex, and you think everything's fine, and then you do this act that you can't take back. You go into this adventure that you can't come back from and you can't regain your innocence from. That part just felt like it was looming over the whole book, and I didn't really appreciate that. If I look at this book on its own with no subtext than the story itself, I really, really enjoy it. But if I think about the meaning behind it, I don't enjoy it as much. And the next book that I read in May was The Horror at Red Hook by H.P. Lovecraft. This is the first H.P. Lovecraft I've ever read. I read this one on audio. I just found a free version of it on YouTube. It's only about an hour long. It's only a 50-page short story. The Horror at Red Hook follows a cop who's in Rhode Island, kind of resting and retiring from a really tough case that he had, and he's thinking back about this case, which took place in the Red Hook area of Brooklyn, New York, where he was on the beat following a criminal underground that was involved with all the immigrants in the area. So Red Hook is a very small hook off of the western side of Brooklyn, and it's kind of isolated, and it has always been a little bit of a place of crime and isolation because of its isolated nature. But in this story specifically, it's a place where immigrants are gathering, where immigrants are coming as a low-income area and living there. So it's definitely like crime-riddled in this story and kind of forgotten and kind of lawless. And so our main character, the cop, is trying to keep that element under control. And as he does this, he's finding out clues and connections to possibly occult happenings there as well. And then when young children start disappearing, he's forced to look into it further and look into some of the crime lords, specifically one man who comes from a decent background but has somehow aligned himself with crime, also seemingly has aligned himself with this occult fascination. The events of the case lead our main character to have kind of nervous fatigue, and the whole story is about what that case entailed. So I won't go into it too much because that would be spoilers, but I have to say that this book was so distractingly racist that I don't know if I really grasped the story 100%. Red Hook, like I said, is a place where many immigrants came, and it was a stopping point at first for poorer communities because it is a low income, and then specifically became a point for that because many housing developments were created there, and many low income, poor, and marginalized groups were pushed into Red Hook, just like they were pushed into Coney Island, just like they were pushed into different areas along the kind of Brooklyn coast, because those areas were subject to flooding, because they were subject to poverty and kind of forgotten by the New York government establishment. That was why a lot of poor, low-income, marginalized families were put into housing developments there. Of course, now they're super popular, they're beautiful, everybody wants to live in places, and now they can't really because they do have a lot of crime and there is a lot of systematic oppression because of housing developments. Anyway, I love Red Hook. It's a great place. The way that this story is written is so racist against all marginalized groups, Black people, Asians, even like Nordic people coming to Brooklyn. They are definitely seen in this story as the root of evil and as evil people and the people who have brought on all these problems that are happening, both the actual problems that people see every day and then these supernatural problems that our main character is now facing. It was just, yeah, it was crazy racist, and it was to the point of distraction. Like I don't think that I fully understood the entire story or grasped the horror of this story because it was horrific to read and to listen to, but because of the way these people were described and the like blatant and unveiled racism that happened. So I did read H.P. Lovecraft's like Wikipedia page to try and find out more like why he held these views, why he wrote his stories about them, and how maybe his racism was connected with his idea of the supernatural, because obviously his supernatural ideas are interesting. There is like merit to his imagination and mind of horror, but I just don't know if I would be able to read too much more of his work really if it's as strongly racist as this particular story was. Those are 3 more books that I read in May, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is June, and I finished 2 final books in May. The second to last book that I finished was Wildlife by Jeff Vandermeer. This is a short story novella from one of those subscriptions. This was about a young woman who seems to have a checkered past, and she moves into her father's old house in a very strange housing development. She tries to garden and make a life there, tries to get to know the neighbors. There's definitely a disconnect between her and the neighbors, and we're not sure as the reader if that's because of her and her past that she is seemingly running from or trying to escape, or if this is because the neighbors are as strange as they appear. She puts up like trail cams and stuff, and the neighbors are wary of her and she is wary of the neighbors. It all kind of ties into this development where they live and this kind of green space in between all the houses that she feels needs nurturing, needs protecting, and that some of the neighbors feel is potentially a threat. This was interesting because this was the first Jeff Vandermeer that I have read that was not part of the Southern Reach trilogy, so it was good to read something else. This also had an interesting kind of timeline to it where it went sort of kind of backwards in time, but also forwards in time. I enjoyed it. It wasn't necessarily one of my favorite of these short stories, and it definitely wasn't my favorite of the Jeff Vandermeer that I've read so far, but I was happy to read another one by him. And then the last book that I read in May was Among Flowers by Jamaica Kincaid. This is a nonfiction memoir of Jamaica Kincaid's travels with a friend of hers who is a master gardener and a seed collector, a seed forager, and they go to the Himalayas in Nepal to seed forage. Now, the reason that this book exists is because National Geographic asked multiple authors to write travel books for them. This reminded me a lot of the Bill Bryson book that I read last year that was very similar. That was created for the CARE Foundation. It was called An African Diary, and this was created for, like I said, National Geographic. There's a lot in the series. Many of them are listed in the back. This was written in the early 2000s, and so I'm definitely interested in picking up more of these works because I do think they're interesting, but I think that they are not a book that the authors would necessarily put a lot of time and effort into, so doesn't necessarily have their signature styles or authorial voice because they're really more of an afterthought. It definitely seems like when these authors are asked to do this, they're doing it for the organization, they're doing it for the free trip to wherever they're going, they're doing it for the experience, and then the book is kind of the outcome of that. But it's not a book that they chose to write and to create. They chose to write it and create it just so they could get a free trip to wherever they were going. That being said, I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was a really interesting look at Jamaica Kincaid, some of her fears and worries, just how her mind works on a regular basis. Now, I've only ever read one other Jamaica Kincaid book, which was also nonfiction. I read A Small Place earlier this year, and that was written in the 70s or 80s and talks about Antigua and the tourism, colonialism that kind of runs Antigua, which is her home island. And this is much more, she's much more settled. Obviously, it's much later in time. She's leaving her young 13-year-old son in Vermont to go on this trip. So it talks a lot about those kind of worries and where she is at life in the present moment, as opposed to like a satirical slash political essay like the last nonfiction that I read of hers. I've seen a lot of people review this recently, which is why I wanted to pick it up. I was super happy to find it at my local bookstore, the AP Book Co-op, and get it right away, like right after I heard people's reviews, which is always such a special moment. But they really didn't like it, and I really did like it. A lot of the people that I read said it didn't have her authorial voice, it didn't have her usual style, it didn't have her kind of sarcastic language that she uses, and I think it did have those things, but I think it didn't have it to the degree because she wasn't writing an author writing parts and people and characters. She was writing about her own life. So if you look at it much more like a diary, not even a super well thought out diary at that, I think it makes more sense. I'm super interested in gardening and seed collecting. I thought that she used an interesting technique where she didn't really call any of the plants by their common names, so she called them all by their Latin names. In a way, it definitely alienated you and isolated you out of the story because I don't know any of the Latin names. I like gardening and I don't know any of the Latin names of the plants that she was talking about. But she also talked about how her garden is in Vermont in the US, and that's in a high elevation area and has a high gardening zone number. So in America, the gardening zones are laid out by, I don't know, the gardening commission or something, and it tells you like what plants will live in what area. So one of her biggest problems that she faced in this book was finding plants that could grow in her area, that could grow in her garden. And I think that she felt insular in that because the other gardeners there could find many more varied plants, and in a way she kind of superimposed that over you by not letting you really feel close to any of the plants. But I did learn a lot about plants that I didn't know before. I didn't know that rhododendrons were actually trees and that they grew to be, 20 or 30 feet high. I didn't know a lot of the plants that she mentioned, some of which I looked up, but most of which I just let go at their Latin names to not take myself out of the story. I'm sorry that other people didn't like it because I think it's really good, even though it had that unpolished feeling. So that was my reading month for May. It was definitely a little bit of a weird reading month because I ended up reading a book a day for the first 20 days in May, which is highly unusual for me. And I ended up reading 22 books total. That's by far the most books that I've ever read in a month. I read so much variety. I read some poetry collections, I read some memoirs, I read some non-fiction, I read a bunch of short horror for Horror Mayhem, I had my first reread of the year, I read a classic vampire tale, I read a reimagining of a classic horror, I read some books that I thought might be horror but weren't. And then I read a ton of books by Asian or Pacific Island authors to highlight Asian and Pacific Island Heritage Month. I read a graphic novel. I read a YA/middle grade book. This was fantastic. I read a interestingly structured book. I read a modern Japanese classic. I finished off a short story in a book that I had already read. And I read a book of poetry. I read a memoir. So many fabulous things for that, and really had me feeling great about reading from different countries and different areas of the world that I hadn't previously read from. I read a cozy mystery for Savage Prompts that unfortunately I didn't really like, but what can you do? And of course I read a non-fiction by a Black author but set in an Asian country. So I had an amazing reading month, just so many books and so many interesting things, and books that I really, really loved and was happy to tick off for May. In June, hopefully I will slow down my reading. I did not intend to read a book a day for 20 days, but I did vlog that experience, so you will be seeing a vlog coming out on that soon. You can also check out my Savage Prompt vlog. Let me know how your reading went in May. Let me know if you read any books by Asian or Asian American authors. And let me know if you read any horror books. You can see a full rundown, a recap of the readathons that I joined in May, the prompts, and all the things that I did for May in my readathon recap video, which will be coming soon. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!